Judges chapter 6, verse 11, we meet this man named Gideon who's hiding out in a wine press. The reason why he's hiding out in a wine press is because, well, Judges chapter 6, verse 6 tells us the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in the mountain dens, caves, and strongholds. Israel was in social isolation, hiding out in the caves and the mountains. The crops were being destroyed by the Midianites, and their economy was tanking. Well, does that sound familiar? We might have a shortage of toilet paper and Lysol, cooking yeast. Couldn't find it the other day. I wanted to bake some things. But for Israel, it was much worse than what we are experiencing with our COVID issues. Israel's safety was threatened. Their food supply, their entire food chain was destroyed. But that doesn't undermine your anxiety that you may feel and the uncertainty that you may feel. A simple act like going shopping or going for a walk now is quite stressful. How are you and your family feeling about this COVID isolation? And how do you think Gideon and his family felt about their isolation, lack of food, lack of future? Verse 6 says, "In their despair, Israel turned back to God and cried for help." So here's a question. Do you think God's help is going to be God miraculously fixing everything while Israel stands passively by? Or is God's help going to be God challenging Gideon and Israel to change from being passive to assertive so that they themselves fix their own problems with God's miraculous help? Well, we soon find out, because the angel of the Lord greets Gideon. Verse 12, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior." Now, valiant is the Hebrew word gibore. It means powerful, champion, chief. Warrior is the Hebrew word ish hachil, and it means man of might. The Lord is with you, O mighty warrior. Now, do you see the irony? Was Gideon acting like a mighty warrior? No. But you can see what God is doing. Gideon, at this moment, was not a valiant warrior. He is the least of his family, and his family is the least of his clan. And he was passively hiding out in a wine press. In Gideon's eyes, Gideon was nothing. But God sees Gideon as the opposite, a mighty warrior. God peers through Gideon's passivity and fear, lack of experience, and God looks into Gideon's future and sees Gideon with God eyes and sees that he will be a mighty warrior. So he already calls him mighty warrior. And so here's a question for you. When you look in the mirror, do you see yourself through God's eyes, mighty warrior? Or do you, like Gideon, look at yourself through your own eyes, passivity, fear, lack of experience, the least of my family, the least of my tribe? How often do we stare in the mirror and see our faults rather than looking at the amazing way that God sees us? How often do we see something in our life that God's calling us to, but instead of looking at ourselves and the situation through God's eyes, we look at the situation and just say, impossible and go back and hide in the wine press and continue in our passive ways? How often do we look at our church and say, oh, we're only 50 people, and we used to be so big. We have no Sunday school. Do we use our human eyes to look at Sherbrooke Sunday morning service? Or do we have the vision to see Sherbrooke Sunday service through God's eyes? Now, as good Anabaptists, we have to take the time to define what a mighty warrior looks like. Jesus is God, and Jesus is the lens that we read all Scripture through. Therefore, our mighty warrior king is Jesus Christ. And we are mighty warriors when we put on the full armor of God and act like Jesus and rise to the occasion that God brings us to, not by killing or destroying. That's Satan's way. Instead, we use Christ's way, which is valiant love, extreme patience, unbridled kindness, determined self-control. So that's what it means to be a mighty warrior in the ways of Jesus. See, goodness and mercy, that's what's in our holsters. And truth, justice, love, that's what's loaded into our cannons. So back to our mighty warrior Gideon. The miracle of our verses is not that the angel of the Lord suddenly appears to Gideon, prophetically calls him mighty warrior in the irony of Gideon's present cowardness. The miracle story is in the next verses that Gideon finds the courage to let go of his current view of himself and instead accept God's view of him, God's radical new future for him. And Gideon receives the truth that he is a mighty warrior, and then he takes the risk and acts upon it. He takes responsibility. He accepts God's invitation for him to radically change the way that he views himself and the way that he acts. And this is the most difficult thing in the world to do. I remember when I was going through a counseling process, I was challenged in the same way that Gideon was. God said to me, Kevin, I know that you're passively hiding in a wine press, but I call you mighty warrior. And then he challenged me to move from this enclosed space into the wide open presence of Jesus living in me. This new type of living was really difficult for me. And I had to look at myself in a different light. And I had to begin to accept the way that God looked at me and see my life through his eyes and my identity through his eyes. An important verse for me during this time was Matthew 18:3. Jesus says, unless you return to square one and start over like children, you're not even going to get a look at the kingdom, let alone get in. And so this miracle is when we offer up our very lives to God, the miracle is that we can give up control, that we have the strength to die to ourselves, that we have the strength to embrace the new ways that he is calling us forward in life. And in counseling, through a series of dying to myself and being rebirthed spiritually, emotionally, I was even rebirthed physically in some ways. Physically, I had a disease called psoriasis on my elbows and on my knees. And I'd gone to doctors and I spent a lot of money on medication. And then through this counseling process of embracing God's view of who I was and working through these hard issues, taking responsibility, getting out of that wine press and into the presence of God in the wide open space of his light, my psoriasis actually disappeared. But it's not easy to change our ways. It's not easy to climb out of the wine press and accept God's view that we are mighty warriors. It's much easier to keep hiding in a wine press, being passive. Now, not all people are passive, you know. Some people are exact opposite, which is equally unhealthy. In our verses, the Midianites are aggressive. And so I've asked Deborah, well, actually, why don't you come along with me? And let's ask Deborah, who's a counselor, what the difference is between passive, aggressive, and assertive. Let's go.
Hi, Kevin.
Hey, Deborah, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Hey, doing great. I just thought I'd bring the church around here and just ask you some questions about passive, aggressive, and assertive. And just wondering if you could answer some questions for us.
Well, funny you should ask. I just happened to have my whiteboard with me today here on our deck.
Oh, great.
Here, let me go through them with you. Okay, so passive people. Passive people, like Gideon, they tend to think they're not okay. They really want other people to like them, so they tend to do things like they won't express what they really think or feel in hopes of being accepted. But by doing that, they are hoping other people understand or figure out what they need. And people don't have ESP, so when people can't figure that out, passive people tend to feel resentful, they will pout, they become passive aggressive, so it just perpetuates this negative cycle. Have you ever heard, like, when you can say that you can push someone over? Well, passive people, they don't wait to be pushed over. They just lay right down and they let other people walk all over them. And that opens the door for aggressive people. So aggressive people, they do express what they think and feel, and they don't care what anybody else says. They think you are not okay. And they see this passive person, they're like, hey, there's someone laying down for me. I'm going to take this opportunity and walk all over them. So they really like to be in control. They have actually a lack of sense of power and control. They're full of fear and humiliation and hurt. And the way they get that, even though it's short term and it's unhealthy, the way they have a full sense of power and control is by bullying, walking all over other people, invading their space. And then we come to assertive people. So assertive people, they also express their thoughts and feelings, but here's the important part, is that they do it with respect for other people. Just like Kevin, you were saying, they have a sense of power and control, and they use that like in a respectful way with others. They take responsibility in relationships, they're able to have intimacy, they don't put themselves down, they don't put other people down, and they don't allow themselves to be put down. And they make their own decisions, and they help other people make their decisions. So there's the differences in a really little nutshell.
When Gideon accepted God's call, Gideon gave God permission for God to gut Gideon's soul and his mind and his body, and then God rebuilt it. And Gideon is a changed man, the opposite of what he used to be. The most challenging part of accepting God's call is that we, like Gideon, have to surrender our lives, surrender the way we think about ourselves, surrender the very way we live to God, and allow God to renovate our lives. Matthew 7:24, Jesus says perfectly, "Anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is like a wise person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rain comes, torrents and the floodwaters rise, the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it's built on bedrock." So as you venture out this week, and maybe you're at the store and feeling anxious, just remember God's presence is with you. Or maybe you're calling someone on the phone and you begin to feel smaller and less than. Remember that God calls you mighty warrior. God's always going to be calling you to something bigger than you can handle, because God is changing you from someone who thinks they can't do certain things, someone who shrinks from responsibility, to someone who stands trembling, perhaps, but stands nevertheless. Not on your own strength, remember, but in the strength of our mighty God. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior.